The snow is dire. We're having like one of the biggest snowfalls we had of the year, I think, right now. I just finished watching Breaking Bad. I watched it when it was first out, um, but it's been a while since then now, and I was a lot more of like a more cynical person then. And I remember enjoying it. It was such a huge show, um, but my criticisms were like, this is sort of comic booky and a little bit unserious in terms of like what are we dealing with, like Mexican cartel members and gangsters and white supremacists and all these things. It's like a white person's fever dream of what kind of fantasy this could be, which it could be like one angle on the show. And also I remember being sort of critical of the ending as well, thinking that it was a pretty safe ending and that they're basically trying to check every list and cover every single possible basis before it ended it. um, and now being like 10, 12 years older and watching it again over the last few months or 6 months or however long it took, um, I don't really think those things the same way it was before. I think that like I really, really, really appreciate how much more like the real conundrums he has are in terms of like family and how things are tied together. I like consistently when I'm watching it realize that even if other people like Jane are bad influence on Jesse or this person's a bad influence on this one, it all does stem from Walt's decision. So to have it like basically be a central protagonist in a story of one person, despite every other character being very, very well done, um, and like well developed, everything that happens comes from him. Everything. And to intricately interweave everything so much takes so much work, and I really respect that. You can understand why the show is so broadly popular, because there might be other shows that appeal to other people more than this one does. You cannot deny the construction of it and just how much better planned this is, like a entire rope full of twine compared to like a very like pretty string. Um, there's two moments in the later seasons that have really stuck with me lately. One being when Hank and Skylar meet at a cafe right near the end, at the beginning of like the third act of the final season, when Hank finally figures everything out. And so much of their conversation is the two of them not talking, and just like you can see Skylar's mind just racing. And to get to a point where you've known these people for 5 seasons, so that you know deeply what she is thinking, what her conundrum is a rare achievement. It's not just like they have to tell you what they're thinking. Like, you know at this point everything that's happened to get them to this point. Hank is also like in my second watch through like probably my favorite character. Like so much bravado and like that sort of fake cheer, which often masks insecurity. But like over time you realize that this guy is like a bulldog and just like totally relentless. And there is like a greater core to his character than you think. He's not just like the kind of jokey, like quasi dickheadish guy from the first side. So his like development and becoming like as grim as the rest of the tone of the show is over time, I think is so amazing. Um, the central conceit of like being like a science teacher, and then you use that structure to basically always have like a problem solving approach to everything that happens, is like a really like smart structure to the show. Like there's so many moments that are so funny in the first couple of seasons, which helps with the rewatchability because they don't play it for laughs, but there's a lot of things that happen, especially in the first season, that are hilarious as they have no idea what they're doing and just trying to figure things out. And it makes it so like the even for such a popular show, like it is like as grim as it gets. Like I don't know how many shows are darker than this by the end. Um, there's not many that like achieve this kind of darkness by the end. It's like, oh man, especially what happens to Jesse's ex-flame in the second last episode. Like that has to be like the saddest it almost was in the entire show, honestly. Um, it's significant that Jesse is the last person that Walt sees. Like over the course of the show, he does everything for his family. He wants to do everything. He always says he's doing everything for his family. But despite him having like this angelic son, and like in many ways like a wife who's like pretty supportive at times, like there's so many points in the first couple of seasons where it's made it abundantly clear that if he just talked to her, or if he just was honest to anybody in his life ever, he could have like had other people around him that helped him. But everything he tries to do, he's constantly trying to out trick everybody, and it's so frustrating to watch. But you actually have to wonder how much he actually like cares about these people. Like he's doing it for his family. He likes the idea of doing it for family, like the idea of the nobleness of it. But I don't think he really gives a shit. Like it's really about him and Jesse. That's the father-son relationship that like matters. His son is sort of like, why is everyone lying to me? Like, what am I supposed to do here? The kid gets a tough rap. Um, I I do kind of get over time why the antagonists of the show are who they are. I remember thinking it was so ridiculous that we're like really scraping the dregs of the barrel with like white supremacists in a fucking compound in the middle of nowhere at the end. But it does make sense, honestly. If you're producing and dealing methamphetamine in New Mexico, this is eventually who you're going to encounter. And things don't like these are pretty merciless people. Like if you don't be careful, they will eventually kind of take you under their shell. Like the sort of more modest beginnings of the first beginning of the show will eventually get to this dark stage. It's kind of like probably what meth is like, or any sort of drug. Like the the typical arc of any sort of movie or someone's like biopic that has to do with drugs. Like it gets pretty down to the dregs by the end of it. Anyway, there's just so many moments that I am largely struck by this time, like how much more they really make sure to hew to the sense of family in the fifth season to remember what this is all about. Like they could have gotten more and more open, they could have got more and more wide stretching in what was happening, but you barely even get like sort of satisfaction from the point that when he makes 90 $100 million, like you don't really see much of that. You just hear about it. Everything is sort of tied in the now, and they do a really good job of bringing it back to where the central dramatic tension is in the final season, which I bet sometimes people were like, come on, I don't really care about this kind of stuff, but this is so important to how it goes. I think the casting, especially some of the later characters like Lydia and Todd, are so good. Lydia is so cold and so chilly and so anxious and so calculating, and the character, the person she did, who got her to do it, she is like that. Like she seems like carved from ice. And Todd is so good because he's like this weird combination of sociopath and like good next door neighbor, like well-raised young man who's kind of gentle, which makes it more chilling. And I just think that's amazing. Not much has to be said about like Mike or Gus or all these things. I know I'm not doing anything like bold by saying I like Breaking Bad, but really what I'm just saying is like the show is so well constructed, and you kind of appreciate that. I think also being older a little bit, you sort of like see that like the tension between the family and how interconnected everything is by his decisions is something that like almost no show does. There's a lot of shows you might like more for being more creative, like a Twin Peaks or a Mad Men or whatever. Like you shows are your favorite. Those are like some of the ones I've always liked, especially Mad Men. But you can't argue with how well constructed the show is and how perfectly like crafted it is. Like those parts of it are like, I don't know, just like extremely undeniable. Having watched Better Call Saul first with like with the two of us, we like always laugh every single time Bob Odenkirk is on screen. Like it's such a joy every single time. He's so funny the entire time. There's like some criticism some like sort of like masculine type guys will say like, oh, why does the show have to be sort of like a psychotherapy grad school style take on how the ego of the husband is the problem. And um I guess I kind of see that to some degree as being like part of this culture from like 2005 till now of like guys are a piece of shit and husbands are, and we're all like the schlubby one and our wives are holding us up. And I don't know, I kind of get that, but it's also very much like a show of its time, and that tone and that view in the culture is part of the time. You even hear videos. There's even like interviews where Vince Gilligan thought he had a different perspective on the show and who Walt was, and it was like basically his cast and crew, especially his crew, told him like, "Yo, you have a way worse character than you think you do. This is more about how he's bad." And so, however that came out and however that resulted, you can kind of look at it. But the reality is, like, basically everyone, or a very high percentage of people who are like older millennial or Gen X or older, especially like the baby boomer generation, like every single person has some sort of like scar tissue from their fathers. Like it has not been a kind century, or maybe even like a kind entire history for like what dads are like and how fucked up they are. So I think that you can't really deny that being like the larger trend. Anyway, really appreciated the show, and it's on my second go through, and it's so much smarter, and like they approach this about as good as it gets. Sometimes random to think like one of the best shows ever, or what's largely considered now by polls to be the best show ever, is one about like a scientist cooking meth in New Mexico. It's so random, but it's not about those details. Those are side parts. And sometimes, yeah, they really do sort of shade down on the gritty parts of like dealing meth and how horrible that. Have you ever seen someone who's on it or see someone who's addicted to it? Like they're the most jarring people to see in the world. It's so unsettling. So they sometimes kind of like under appreciate those things, even though when they show all messed up people, it does look like a grimy, depressing scene. So those are weird parts of it as well. But I mean, ultimately, like, fucking bravo.